it's really easy. I remember being in that situation, you know, as a college student, and being very divided on my own conscience because, you know, growing up, I would have argued with you, I would have debated with you the fact that abortion was wrong. But when it becomes a very personal thing, and when you are in that situation, things look a whole lot different. And that's where I found myself, you know, and so it's feeling like all those options are so big and so scary, and realizing all the questions that were to be asked.
Yes, all the looks.
All the looks, all the questions, and the shame that goes along with that. It was something that I couldn't bear. And you know, so I did have an abortion, and it's it haunted me, but my mission now is to share that because there's redemption in that.
All right, well, welcome to episode 15 of Studio Conversations. I'm here with Tanelle, Forgy, and Alli
Tobin-WIlliams.
Xavier's wife. He goes to our church. Awesome guy. I don't know your husband. I apologize. We got a doozy for you today. I decided to step into the, I don't know what we want to call it, but kind of the pro-life, pro-choice as a Christian. I decided to jump into that pool. So I will say some things, but mainly defer to the experts over here and just try to get some wisdom from some very strong, smart women on the topic. Hopefully I can learn some stuff. Feel free to correct me if I ever say something that's dumb, because that happens a lot if you've ever watched this. I'll kind of tell you why I have been thinking through this. I mean, clearly, culturally speaking, pro-life, pro-choice is a very divisive topic. A lot of people are just go 100% this or that, and they demonize the other side, and it's just this huge line of division in our culture. I don't like divisiveness. I like finding that middle ground. My friend Nathan said it's the politician in me. My dad's a politician, but I guess I picked up some of that along the way. And so as I've looked at this topic, and I've done research on it, and you know, just listened to countless debates and all this kind of stuff, I've kind of found my footing, and I know where I stand on it. But despite that, there's still just, whenever I talk to people, it's so grindy. Like, I don't know how else to say it. But basically, kind of my stance on it is, I try to be a voice for the voiceless. That's kind of my heart behind my pro-life stance. It's just there's this whole section of people that just can't advocate for themselves, and so I want to do that. But at the same time, I don't want to discount the mothers in it, because they are also a person who needs advocacy as well. And so I recognize kind of the difficulty in that. And the thing that's been frustrating is the pro-life, pro-choice, it's very binary, just the way it's talked about culturally. Not in actuality necessarily, but it's very pro-choice means abortion, pro-life means not abortion, and that's it. But really, pro-choice can mean adoption. It can mean seeking counseling. It can mean getting low-income housing if that's part of the, like, there's so much to all of that I want to try to talk through that with some experts.
Okay.
So first, I'll ask you to kind of introduce yourself and what you do, why you're here, and why I'm calling you experts, and then we'll get into it a little more. So if we can.
My name is Tanelle Forgy, and I am the executive director at Pregnancy Counseling Services, which is the only resource pregnancy center in El Dorado County. So I've been there for 2.5 years, and that's why I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm Alli Tobin-WIlliams. I'm an OBGYN physician here in Placerville and Cameron Park, and I take care of women and do a lot of pregnancy counseling. And I've been here about 13 years.
And at this church, or
I've been at this church. I thought about that. How many years have we been here? And I think it's about 4, but
Okay.
I'm not 100%
Okay.
sure on that. But we've been at this church. We've been in Cameron Park, but we've been fellowshipping at this church. I think it's about 4 years now.
Okay. So I gave a little bit about why it's been on my mind to talk about this, some of my kind of history with this topic and stuff. Do you guys want to kind of elaborate a little? I mean, obviously you said you work at PCS, but I mean, beyond that, is there like a more, like, why did you want to be here to talk about this today?
I mean, this topic is just it's divisive. You know, obviously with what I do, we're in it, and I'm talking to women, and you know, I just feel like God really wants to make sure that we understand that He is accountability, but He's also grace. So that's just been on my heart for the last year, really strongly. Is just this accountability and grace message. So, you know, yes, you know, pro-life is my stance, and you know, a voice for the voiceless, and you know, and life starts in the womb. But there's also, in what we do at PCS, there's also compassion for those who have made that choice in their past. So, in forgiveness and redemption back to their Father. So,
I think it's a really important subject to kind of unwrap in the church, because there's a lot of misconceptions about the prevalence of terminations and who's having them. And, you know, there's about 1 in 4 women in their lifetime will have had a termination. So it's tragic, but if we scan our congregation, there are women, many in them, who maybe at some time in their life have had a termination and love Jesus. And so being able to really understand the full breadth of the problem that our culture is facing in regards to abortion, and understand the reasons why people pursue them, might give us the capacity to address those things so that we have fewer of them. I think a lot of the stance has been attacking the individual, but a lot of times you won't know who had a termination and who didn't. And being able to discuss it with grace allows those individuals who perhaps have had one in their life to have a sense of forgiveness and the capacity to then advocate as well, more freely and more openly. And I do think that in my profession, we are right in the middle of that battle. You know, being a Christian, and I'm very forward with my faith to my patients. I let them know I love Jesus and I'm a Christian. And so, you know, what my general biases are, because I have them.
Sure.
And then being able to give women really fair, not inflammatory reasons why they shouldn't have a termination, or being able to walk with them about particular complications that they are vulnerable to if they pursued their pregnancy. And trying to counsel them fairly about their decisions, and then walk with them afterwards, because it's a lot of people may presume that they will make a decision one way on either side, but that's not always the case when they're faced with difficulties or anomalies or other things that might complicate the outcomes. And so, although, you know, I might have a very adamant my own self belief that to stand, you know, for pro-life, there's an importance of really being able to fairly discuss the totality of it, and to be in a space that people can feel welcome to express what their particular concerns are, and feel that there's grace and love and healing, more importantly, for them, if they did decide to pursue.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things in this, and I mean, you touched on it a little bit, is that typically when you hear a debate in the public space or whatever, it's all very much in generalities. Like it's, this is this and this is this and this is this, and when one side is demonizing the other, they're demonizing a broad general group of people, and the decisions are made because of this broad general reason, and it doesn't bring it into the real life and we're talking about Mary, we're talking about Shauna, whatever. Like it's very broad, and so I feel like kind of what you're saying is like, when you're dealing with those individual women, you kind of need to meet them where they're at,
Exactly.
essentially, and kind of bring truth and grace into that and walk with them through the consequences of their actions. I mean, in
Most
grace,
definitely.
not like,
Right,
Yeah.
but to have options for them, as and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some statistics because that's helpful
No, that's
as well,
good.
and I know
Yeah,
you'll be able to
most
bring a lot of that as
I
well.
don't know any of that stuff, so bring it all in. Bring it all in.
But they looked at a study, and this was in 2017, and this was in the state of California, and they asked about the religious faith of the individuals that were pursuing a termination, and they found that when they looked at now these statistics aren't additive, but about 36% of individuals pursuing a termination were Protestant, and about 24% self-declared themselves as Catholic.
Okay.
And so this, might be surprising to some of because these may tend to be very traditionally pro-life groups, but I think that within the church we're more reflective of the general community than we believe we
sure.
are. And
Divorce rates in the church.
divorce rates, exactly,
for sure.
broken families,
Yeah.
relationships outside of marriage,
Yeah.
all of the issues that have been looked at to be potential risk factors or that coincide with increasing abortion rates are involved in the church community.
Yeah.
Totally,
And
yeah.
so we can't, discuss those things without recognizing that this other impact is likely involved as well.
Right.
And so I think that this is, that's why this makes this a good topic for us to address because it's kind of one of those undiscussed topics. It's a
Right.
kind of presumed that everyone feels the same way
Right.
or that has the same experience, and that I think that would be a failure on our part,
Right.
because then we can't get to what's what we need to discuss.
And what makes it so tricky,
Right.
as you're saying, is because it's so done in secret,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Exactly.
whenever a discussion is had at the pregnancy center with a woman, it boils down to her heart, right? And it can be done very quietly and very, discreetly, so that, you have no idea.
Right. And you
And
wouldn't necessarily be able to, and you shouldn't assume. And so sometimes in our adamant conversations, it can be heartbreaking to the person that's sitting next to us, and we don't necessarily recognize
Right.
that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times there's discussion about when we feel that, life starts, and as Christians, we constantly will say life, initiates in the womb, and there's definitely scientific evidence supportive
Right.
of that aspect. So that's not the debated part, whether or not it's, a baby. And you
Not
could ask the
anymore.
same woman who had a termination when she had a miscarriage, her perception of that experience is very different. But it could be the same person who had a termination 3-4 years earlier that in that miscarriage she lost her baby.
Right.
And it could be the same time frame.
Right.
It is as you said, in that engagement in their heart, and that perhaps where they are in their life, and how they perceive it. And I think our bigger goal is like you said, meeting people where they are, and hopefully addressing some of the issues that we have before we get to this point, so that we
Right.
can prevent
Right.
these concerns, and then also having options that are real, that, instead of just verbiage that, oh, well, you could adopt and
Sure,
oh, you could
yeah,
do
yeah.
this. And,
Right.
This sounds very good. But
But where is it? Yeah.
as a church, we really should be a force that really does
Totally.
respond. And, I think last year there were like almost 900 or 950,000 terminations in the United States. And, about 150,000 in California. And so this is at our doorstep. This
Right.
is
Yeah,
this is
absolutely.
real, and nations is impacted by this.
Right.
So I think it's not just something for individuals who are, deep into this in their careers
Sure.
as well, but also for every person.
Right.
Because you may see, a teenager who's pregnant and, do you look at them differently? Do you embrace their boldness that they would pursue their pregnancy when clearly it is not the cool thing to do when you're 17 and everyone's going to the prom and you're,
They have a lot
you
stacked
know,
against them.
instead
Yeah.
of seeing them as, a place of, shame or disgrace, or seeing them as what they are and being very bold, young women to do something that is not easy when their colleague,
Right.
just hid that situation and comes off looking, better than
Right,
they do
right.
in the eyes of their friends. So
Yeah, and
That's true.
there's so many things you just said that I want to hit on. I normally go in reverse order, so I'll try to do that because that's where it's freshest.
Okay.
So, that's an interesting perspective with a 17-year-old girl or whatever. Because it's easy to look. I think a lot of people would look at that and be like, oh, well, we shouldn't be having sex out of wedlock. Which, yeah, I fully agree with.
Right.
Like, I was a youth pastor for 10 years. I'm like, make better choices,
Right.
and you don't deal with that. But
Right.
when you get to that point, she made the right choice to keep
Right.
it. And so that should be celebrated, and the community should come around her. Because she's going to be a pariah. She's going to be a pariah within the church because typically that's like, oh my goodness, what is she doing?
Right.
But if she's coming to church and she's learning about Jesus, like she needs
Right.
to be embraced because she's making that kind of thing. And that is a challenge. It hasn't been a huge one for me, I guess, because I did youth ministry and I experienced that and whatever. But, I my daughters are like 3.5, so I haven't been like thinking about this. But future, if something like that were to happen, the emotion of a parent that comes into that is way different than someone kind of on the sidelines. But my goal as a father is to push my girls towards Jesus and
Right.
let them know the love of their Heavenly Father, but support them despite whatever they do.
Right.
Now if they're running off a cliff, I'm going to
Right.
push them and stop them from running off the cliff.
Hopefully
But-
you're
You're
right
not gonna push
direction.
them. Yeah.
Push them away from the cliff.
Dang
Not
it.
over.
You won't push them off the cliff. I promise.
I'll grab them. I'll stop them.
Exactly.
Push was a bad word.
Tackle.
But I mean, we need to, because Jesus, the woman caught in adultery,
Right.
he says, I do not condemn you, but go and sin no more.
Exactly.
Like he meets her and he's like, this is wrong. Like what you're doing is
Exactly.
wrong. Everything they're doing is also wrong.
Right.
So now that you recognize that, go this way. So that's always my desire with my girls and with that girl.
Right.
And I want to get to the options thing in a sec because I think that's a good
Yeah.
next path.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
This idea, because you mentioned very correctly about the realities within the church and how we're like, we're great and we're godly and look at the people out there in the community.
holy.
Wow. Yeah. Any guy's internet search history in the past month would probably show that. Maybe a woman as well. There is just a reality that we are broken people,
Yes.
that we are saved and sanctified by Jesus, and that sin is not held against us. Praise God for that.
Yes.
Right.
But we need to recognize that I think Paul says our righteousness is like filthy rags. I think the original King James says a curse word instead of filthy rags. And so it's like we need to realize that, yes, we have been saved and sanctified, but ultimately we're still messy. And we need that spirit to change us and change our hearts. He's wiped away the past, but that past is still there.
Right.
And so we need to be like, wow, I was forgiven of a lot. I need to
Absolutely.
forgive a lot
Correct.
and have that kind of compassion.
Correct.
So those were the two things I thought of. As far as practical options kind of stuff, because you're right, it is easy to say like, yeah, there's adoption and that's a thing. But a lot of people don't even know where to go for some of that stuff, and I know PCS does some of that, so we
Sure.
can talk through some of that and move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to, and I'll go off on a tangent here for a second. It's really easy. I remember being in that situation,
Yeah.
as a college student,
Right.
and being very divided on my own conscience because, growing up, I would have argued with you, I would have debated with you the fact that abortion was wrong. But when it becomes a very personal thing, and when you are in that situation,
Right.
things look a whole lot different.
Right.
And that's where I found myself, and so it's feeling like all those options
Right.
are so big
Right.
and so scary, and realizing all the questions that were to be asked,
Yes. All the looks.
all the looks, all the questions, and the shame that goes along with that. It was something that I couldn't bear,
Right.
and so I did have an abortion, and it's it haunted me, but my mission now is to share that because there's redemption in that, and going through the Bible study and going through Forgiven and Set Free and taking that time with the Lord in that was unbelievable. I mean, it was one of the most sweetest moments that I had with Him in that time, and so now I've realized in that is that Satan wants those women that are in all of our churches
Yeah.
to be quiet about that.
Exactly.
He wants us to be silent in our shame, because when we're silent in our shame, he gets to play with us. He gets to play with our head and make us feel like we're not worthy, or that it's an unforgivable sin. And so that's been my heart and my mission over the last couple of years, is to just share that, to share it in churches so that women in the churches can realize, you know what? I can come forward on this. And I've had women come forward and share it after 30 years and find forgiveness. And so that is definitely where my heart is. And so when you talk about this topic, we always have to be careful, right? And I think churches don't necessarily want to get into it because it's such a political issue. But what we forget is that it's a spiritual issue.
Right.
It is one of the most divided issues in our country right now because it's at the closest to His heart.
Exactly.
Of course it's going to be spiritually attacked.
Exactly.
And so it's hard, and I don't want churches to shy away from it,
Right.
because, and I'm so glad that we're doing this, because it's, if the congregations aren't getting their truth from their leadership,
Exactly.
where are they going to get their truth
Exactly.
from?
And if we fail to talk about the things that people need to hear about,
Right.
I definitely think this is a topic that women need to hear about, because there is that stigma that they may carry with them of unforgiveness because they haven't been able to let that sin go, and to realize that just like every other sin in their life, God is capable of forgiving them, and to use their experience to bless other people. There's nothing like saying, I've been there, right where you're standing, and I know how scary it is, and to say, I made the decision that you're contemplating, and I wish I didn't, or I made the decision and I understand, and I struggle with that, just to be able to be honest in that moment with them. A lot of our culture is very comfortable advocating for the positives of pursuing termination. Many, a vast majority of a kind of higher percentage of terminations occur in college-age women because they're, in between their education, their
Career.
work. They may be very early in their careers. There's often, they may not be married. About 24% of the time there are women who are not married at the time. They may or may not be in a long-term relationship. And it's not something that women forget. There's a very small subset of women who have terminations that when you talk to them, they are flippant about it.
Sure.
It is a very small subset.
Sure.
The vast majority of them hide it or cloak it. You have to ask 5 different ways to get that info out of them. They may be mothers with 8 children, clearly they have established their maternal, service, and but they are reluctant to admit. I want to share a story, and I think I can share it because it's kind of I don't think it's HIPAA violation, but I had no names exactly. I had a 80-something-year-old woman that I met once in an emergency room. And I'm going through his 80-something. I'm not going to say specific age, so it'll be a little protective, but mid-80s. And I'm talking about, her life or what have you. And she says, well, I did have a D&C once. And I said, okay, all right, great. I can't remember exactly why I was seeing them. And she said, that doctor, he knew I was pregnant, but he told them that, I'd had a miscarriage. And he knew I hadn't, and it's a very covert way of her telling me. Now she's in her 80s, so this is way back when it was not nearly as cavalier to have terminations. They weren't procedures that were performed, and her way of telling me that she terminated. Now she is a great grandma,
Right.
But this wasn't something that she could. That she had let go of, that she had forgotten, that had, washed away with all the other things in her life. And so it's so important that women can feel the freedom and the space and the covering to be able to be, completely transparent or vulnerable with decisions that they've made. And I agree, the enemy wants to cloak it so that you won't help that teenager that's, struggling with it, and you won't say anything that might free this other person who is in, bondage or depressed as a sequelae of what had happened to them. And so it's definitely, I think the work of the enemy to keep things in the shadows and to keep it in darkness and to not be able to discuss it, in the forum where we're supposed to be able to, be free. And clearly, Jesus is not afraid of dealing with our deepest, darkest issues. He's not, he doesn't shy from confronting them either.
Yeah. Again, the woman caught in
With
adultery is
compassion,
like,
yeah.
actually, you've been with these other people, and you're with a different.
Very matter of fact.
I mean, he's just like, boom.
This is how it is.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or for the, gentlemen that are standing there, he's like, well, the first one who hasn't
Right.
committed the same sin,
Yeah.
go ahead and toss that stone.
Yeah.
Right.
no.
And so, people just, feather away.
Right.
And so
Where
I
are your
think that.
accusers?
Exactly. And there are none. Exactly. And that he wasn't her accuser.
Right.
And so a lot of times we think, the enemy is the accuser. That is his role. That is what he does. And that it is not God who is accusing us of our sins. He died to wash us of all of our sins. And he knew that sin before we were born, before he committed to do that. So it isn't that there's something that is too difficult for him to, forgive. Exactly. And so for us, there shouldn't be something that is too, it shouldn't be something that's too difficult for us to forgive as well.
Right.
It reminds me, we did a podcast just kind of on marriage and divorce and stuff like that a while ago. And it reminds me of a similar kind of topic in that a lot of people, when they're facing like huge marital turmoil, because the church, I would say rightly so, emphasizes the importance of marriage and that divorce can be very harmful and all these things. A lot of people bottle that up and they don't seek counseling, they don't seek accountability, they don't just seek being able to share with other people, and so it festers and it festers and festers until things fall apart or whatever. And what we encourage in that conversation is, I feel like what you're saying is, find someone healthy and safe to talk to and talk to them. If that's one of your pastors, great. If that's women's ministry leaders, great. If that's just another woman in the church, great. But don't bottle it up. You need to have, we were made in the image of God, which is triune, in community, and so we're supposed to go through life in community, and so I think that's, that's kind of what you're saying.
I think most of our worst sins are the ones, they are done in secret, and they're cloaked in secrecy. And I think for most people, if they had that ability to discuss, in truth what's going on, and not feel like that it's in, that we're going to respond as if we've never failed. If we've never faced a failing in our own lives. Because that's sometimes what happens in the church. We respond, instead of responding in righteousness, which is, from Jesus, we are
not self-righteous.
We respond in self-righteousness, which is untrue. And, so I think, definitely we want people to reach out, but I think all of us really need to search our own hearts to make sure that if someone does reach out to you, you don't have to have had that same experience to respond in compassion, respond in truth and say, well, we know these things are true. We're not saying to discredit the gospel. We want to stand on the gospel. And it is true that this is where life starts. And it is true that God can, get us through any difficult situation, and that he's provided for this situation before it even started, and that, and that he's with us, and that, that the things that he promises us are truths that we can stand on. So I don't think we have to, advocate for something that isn't consistent with our belief system. But we can do all of that in compassion and love and our own vulnerability, which I think helps the individual feel, that they're not going to be judged if they, have a big issue.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah, and tell me if you, when it comes to stuff like that, like, things that I'm holding on to, things that I'm hiding, I find when I finally talk to someone about it who doesn't have that self-righteousness, but they have that righteousness from Christ, and they're like, man, I get it.
Right.
I'm all of a sudden like, why did I hold on to that?
It's not as big anymore.
It diffuses it completely.
It is Satan trying to keep you within yourself and keep you living in that shame. And then when you finally bring it out to the light, the love and compassion of Jesus, who, as you perfectly said, died for it even before you did it.
Exactly.
So there's huge freedom in that. Hey, this is where I'm at, and I don't like it. Maybe I'm ashamed of it. Maybe I do like it, and I just want your input. But there's huge freedom in getting that out there. So.
Right. No, I'm just going to say that some of those processes are us repenting, and it's in relation to our Holy Father, and remembering that if we don't accept His forgiveness by forgiving ourselves. I talk about this a lot in our classes. It's like a present on the table, beautifully wrapped in the most amazing wrapping paper, bow, everything, but we don't open it. If we don't take it, it's like not opening up the present, right? So I think there's a lot of exactly. So for those women who are sitting in that shame, in their silence, and they're not accepting the forgiveness from him, it's like not accepting his gift. It's like all for nothing. And that's what I want women to realize, that there is forgiveness in that.
100%.
Yeah.
So I want to talk kind of practically speaking, just because I do think within this binary conversation, like I kind of jokingly say I'm pro-choice with an asterisk, and I just don't like one of the choices, but all the other ones I'm a big fan of. But I think those other ones don't get talked about very often, and I think PCS kind of deals with a lot of that stuff. So can you tell me? So someone walks into your offices. What are the options? I mean, how are they received? What are the options?
Most of the time, I mean, and I find it interesting sometimes that we don't always know that even if a client puts on her paperwork that she is not considering an abortion, that's not always the case, and that we never really know what they're considering. So I think one of the biggest things for me with PCS is that it's a place of hope. And it's a place where I've told women who have come in before, almost midway through their pregnancies, and they just feel like there's just medical issues, and there's this, and there's that, and there's no support, and realizing, just letting them talk that out, right? I find that most of the time when I have conversations with women that might even start, could you refer to me for an abortion, which we don't refer for an abortion. But when they initially might call for an abortion, within a couple minutes of talking, they're saying, well, I don't really want an abortion. So it's very interesting that once you start to let a woman be heard, right, her true heart comes out in conversation. And so there's so many other reasons why she might feel like she needs to get an abortion. But that if you just give her space, and that's what PCS is, right? That space where they can talk. Right. And they can talk freely, because you know what? I'm not your boyfriend. I'm not your mom. I'm not, right? I'm a completely non-partisan,
objective third party.
Yes.
That's why I love counseling. It's great.
Woo! But once she kind of starts to talk things out, again, when you talk about things, things don't seem so big, or things don't seem so scary.
Right.
But practically speaking, of course, there are adoption agencies that we can, walk her through. We have somebody that will do some adoption counseling who has adopted herself, has counseled a lot of women on just that process. So she's always available. And then, we have parenting and pregnancy education. So just those things and resources to come alongside her to say, hey, you don't have to do this alone. Yes, we can't be with you 24/7, but we can be in relation with you.
Right.
And we're starting to see clients repeatedly, like they're coming in, weekly, every other week, and they're staying with us, which is great, because sharing the gospel and loving on them is done in relationship.
Exactly.
So
now I know some of the options out there deal with like women who are in abusive relationships, or women who have just very low income, and so part of the reason that they want to have this abortion is because they're like, I can't afford this, or I can't be with this child's father because he's abusive, or whatever. What are options? I don't totally know. So what are some options?
I know, like in our community, we have a couple of programs. So there's Mother Teresa's, which is a resource for pregnant women who are in abusive relationships.
Okay.
And it is a house that they actually stay in, so it's housing and shelter and food, and it is secured so that their partners cannot have access to them. They are able to stay there with their younger infant children, and then they work to try and help them transition to more independent housing. There's also Hope House, which is in conjunction with Green Valley Church.
Okay.
And there are nurses that are involved there. I just know one of the nurses that serves as a counselor there. And they provide a similar scenario where they do have a longer-term housing option for single moms and their children. Different churches. I'm always throwing churches under the bus. So if you guys are getting phone calls, don't let me down. And that I do constantly refer women, not only pregnant women, but also women who are getting their care, or they're, having a second child to our churches, because I feel like in the community we really need to put our money where our mouth is, and that there are young women who, they may be with the father of the baby, they may not. They don't have a lot of resources and things like, not necessarily, like strollers or bouncy seats or someone to help me, make sure that I'm getting clothing or diapers or things like that. We do often refer them to those resources. And I kind of feel like it makes, that's the door we're supposed to knock on, that's supposed to answer.
Yeah.
And, what would be amazing is if we had a core of women predominantly who, agreed to come alongside of individuals that were willing
To mentor almost.
to mentor,
Yeah.
it is something that could happen from women of any age, but I really feel that it's something that women who are more advanced in their age, that
Seasoned.
are seasoned,
Well
Established.
well seasoned and established. These are women who are transitioning in menopause and past that time, because it offers a different openness
Perspective,
and a perspective in their life, that are able to come alongside and be a blessing to them on a more ongoing basis. It's definitely something that's needed, because there are some women where they don't want to give their children up, but as they look forward and they think, oh my gosh, this is baby number 4, how am I going to do this? It's just me. And having someone in their life that's a resource that says you're not out here alone.
Right.
And I'm not necessarily saying that they do all the care, but just that they're able to give some perspective, and the things that are heavy right now aren't always going to be so heavy.
Right.
And that to try and not make lifelong decisions for a short-term concern, which a lot of times is part of what happens.
Totally.
And so I'm going to list our churches as a resource, and which I think it's definitely something that all of us could expand in, to be able to just reach out and say, hey, there's a single mom and she could use some help. And it would be nice if the pregnancy, center had, I'm just going to call so-and-so over here, and they've got, an advocate that, they will hook you up with someone who works.
Okay, so all churches, we need
all churches,
all representatives.
exactly.
All about it.
Exactly.
All about it.
That's all my to-do list.
That's right. Let's all.
But there's also so Cornerstone of Hope too is up near in Pollock Pines as well.
Wonderful.
So very similar to Hope House, kind of the same setup. They worked with Hope House to set their house up as well. So we have definitely a few homes in the area.
Right.
That's
for
great.
these
And
women.
I mean, there's a lot in Sacramento and I live in Rancho Cordova,
Right.
but kind of throughout the area, these places exist. How do you find them? Because I often hear like it's hard to find them. Like it's really easy to find kind of the opposite.
Right, exactly. Everyone knows where terminations happen. That's very well advocated for.
Yes.
And I do think there's a not as much information that's available. I think we learn about the programs because this is part of what we do. And they are available. They are online and they are listed. But
if you were to search,
if you were to search for them. But if you had a question, contacting an organization like, the Pregnancy Counseling Center would be an option to kind of get you started so that they could, I think you guys do a lot at pointing people to what are the resources for their particular needs, and then trying to connect with get them connected with those organizations.
Yeah,
So.
and we'll definitely connect, like if they're seeking mom support groups or those kinds of things too. We've been known to connect them with churches and moms groups in the area. So again, just whatever their resources, meeting them when they're at where they're at, right? And realizing that again, there's answers, there's hope, there's clothing at our facility, there's maternity clothes. I mean, there's stuff that we can do to meet their more dire physical needs.
And I think when you're able to address people's practical needs, then they can, greater focus on all of these theoretical things to take a deep breath in. Our county is pretty well established with programs like WIC and things that help moms, get resources for food substances and things like that. But for us, we try and advocate for those resources. We connect them with public health nursing that sometimes can also help them get connected to resources if there's a need there. But I think that there are resources available. What I find is a little challenging is that it does seem a little binary in their decisions that they could terminate, they could give their baby up for adoption, and they could keep their baby. And that's why I like the idea of the advocacy, because it allows for you to have a lot more hybrids in between the adoption and the keeping. That you've got, people who have kind of pulled you under their wing so that, if you decided to keep them, you don't have to do that alone. One of the things that's most perplexing for me is when I'm counseling women that could not contemplate adoption, and they choose termination instead because they said, well, I could never give my baby up.
Right.
And that's a very hard,
I've heard that before.
Yeah, it's a very hard
That's difficult.
discussion to be in, to say, and at that times I tend to make it very concrete for them to say, well, is it better for your baby not to have a life than to have a life that, flourishes and it's without you. And it's not that, and we advocate for women and a little bit of, definitely trying to see their situation, but also advocating, that it's not just that the termination affects the life of the infant, it affects the life of the person. And it impacts them, and it can change them in a way, and giving them an opportunity to make a decision that didn't tend to have as long of an impact on them. But, there are a lot of women who have that, that is their decision tree. It's either, keeping it or terminating it. We haven't emphasized or lifted up the in-between enough to make it something that was honored, that they gave their baby up for adoption and that they gave their child an opportunity, and that this was a wonderful gift. And for us, we're often trying to advocate that, this is an amazing gesture that is done and impacts this other family in
a very
a
positive
very
way.
positive way.
Yeah.
I mean, we get petitions for, please tell people we want babies.
I know.
We can't give those out, so don't stop sending them. But exactly, it's just it puts us in a bad posture, but we can't give them out. But we do constantly get petitions, and there are lots of adoptions that happen in the parameters of churches and that are not expensive, and because that's sometimes a hindrance to it. And so in the confines of our own community, we're able to say, hey, if you run into someone who is in a situation, make them aware that I'm here. So in the confines of our community, we're able to do that, but I don't know that we've had that well established that, if you want to know or if you consider that there are those opportunities in our family to be able to address that need, which might feel closer to individuals
within the church,
than women, because some women do make that binary decision. It's either all or none, where we do have this middle ground, which we haven't fully promoted, and we would all do better to say, there's room, because most of the times if I came to you and I said, hey, there's another little girl, and they're going to be born, and would you be willing? Most people would say, okay.
Woo!
Yes,
if they're
Jesus,
just asked, right? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. If they're asked,
exactly. Yeah. But we, and that's where I said it would. As a church, we do need to expand our willingness and our openness to embrace, those things, because, and in our community, we can make a huge difference. So.
Yeah, and I don't, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around adoption too, right? Like I don't think that women realize how that they have control in those situations, right? I mean, they get to choose, they get to pick the family, they get to decide whether it's open. I know a lot of very successful open adoptions, and
they can have communication to some degree that's agreed upon, ongoing. That many adoptions, like you said, they're not closed, and they're open to the mother, being aware and having a connection with the family and the child, and so ongoing, not just a one-time thing.
So again, just education, right? Just educating about that process is so important.
Yeah. No, and you again reminded me of the pregnant teenage girl in the same way, that like binary choice of if they do choose adoption, that they feel some kind of shame there, and it's like, no, again, celebration. That's great. That's a good choice. I mean, obviously we want children to be with their mothers, but if the option is termination or adoption, praise God for adoption. And this has been another one of my things that I've caveated a lot in the past in these kind of conversations is, people with a staunchly pro-life choice but are like, nah, I'll never adopt. I'm like, all right. I'm not saying you can't be pro-life and not adopt or not want to adopt. I get that adopting a child is a lot. But if we want there to be a place for children, there needs to be at least an openness, like, okay, let me pray about that. Let me, whatever. Like, we need to be a part of the solution in that sense. Like, if we're going to say, no, don't do this, it's bad, the child needs to live, and then you figure it out. It's like the church needs to come in. And I know Foothills Church, once a year we do there's an adoption month where we kind of highlight that and all that kind of stuff, which is great. And we can always expand upon that. And, I think this kind of conversation is so good because it is just, it's so easy to put each other in simple boxes in our culture. And then it gets real murky when you start giving options, but it allows for better conversation, better decision making. Like, you don't make it out of fear. You make it out of understanding and, whatever.
Well, we know that Jesus believes in adoption because we're all adopted. Most of us are not Jewish from the nation of Israel. And so he completely believes in adoption and grafting, into your own. And I definitely agree with you, say that children need, if a family can stay together, that's ideal, but children need mothers and fathers. And God is creative at how he directs that. And so, for all of us should, like you said, if we're declaring that we are pro-life, we should also be declaring that we are willing to embrace these children that are born in more difficult situations. And
or even support other families that are willing.
To do it, exactly. Yeah. And I think embracing the children, I just wanted to emphasize that doesn't all the time mean holistically this child comes to my house. That's why I said I think there's so much more room for all of us. Even if we look around our church, you may recognize, wow, that's a mom and she comes every week and she's dragging her sweet little ones with her. How could I help her? How could I bless her in that situation and bless what she is doing in that in those difficulties, and get to know her a little bit more, and come alongside, like I said, and be a blessing. We do have programs that we have for safe families that goes through our Foothills Church, that when people are in times of distress and they're going to be separated from their
benevolent
kids,
ministry.
yes. And that you could come alongside and foster them for a short period of time or what have you. But there's definitely a disconnect between what we're promoting and, in the sense of the safety net that we provide. And so I think that there does need to be more adoption,
Sure,
and
yeah.
and that we need to not be afraid of that concept. That's a good thing.
No, I mean, I actually have an adopted niece and nephew, and I mean,
Wonderful.
they're awesome. And that was one of the reasons when we had our second, she's 1.5 now. I'm like, oh man, going through this again. And if we wanted to have a boy or something, I'm like, there's no way to guarantee
Right.
except maybe adoption or whatever. So
You
we've
can pick up. That's
Right. Yeah.
that one.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, we've definitely talked about adoption, and right now we're still in the tired phase.
Right.
So
Right.
now's not the moment, but
Right.
my heart is definitely open to it. I
Right.
love kids so much.
Exactly.
They're just such a blessing to.
Exactly.
I mean, they get
Yeah. They didn't ask for these situations.
No.
right, right,
Exactly.
absolutely not.
Exactly. So,
Okay, so I have one. This is kind of an aside, but it's something kind of near and dear to my heart when it comes to this subject, and maybe it's more cultural, but I kind of hear within the cultural conversation that men have no say and no ability to speak into this situation, which for me, as someone who just like loves and cares for babies and just feels like God has a plan for them and all that, I kind of reject that. I'm like, no, God has put that on my heart, so I'm not going to. But I will admit that I don't have the experience. I don't have a lot of wisdom and knowledge on it. So speaking to me or just other men who are passionate about this and who want to advocate for women and advocate for children, how do we approach this subject with grace? A lot of times guys lend a little heavier on truth. So,
Right.
maybe we need to add a little grace and compassion to that. But how do we approach this subject in a way that we can truly support and come alongside women, but not just feel like our voice doesn't matter, to feel like we actually have some kind of say? Because culturally speaking, we kind of don't. But we're in the church, so we're not supposed to work exactly as culture works, hopefully.
Right.
Right.
Best case scenario. So, I mean, how do you respond to that?
I mean, so we're talking about two different things. So in the church and in the world, right? I mean, in the world, I would say, as a man, you need to support, right? You need to be there. You need to, right? In the church, I think there's a lot of advocacy for those younger men in those situations. And that's something that I'm hoping to grow PCS in, but having some sort of same thing we're talking about, these mentors, right? For those, there needs to be those for the men. There needs to be some sort of
Babies don't come from nowhere, is what you're telling me.
right. It's not
single
just
action.
yeah. We're not just talking here to support the woman,
Right.
but there's always a man involved.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Right.
where is he? And if he is even remotely in the situation at all, he needs mentorship too. He needs support as well. He needs he needs to be heard and to have somebody to counsel him in that advocacy kind of role. So again, I think that is where the men in the church can really come forward on and be present in.
I think it is a little bit tricky for adult men in the context of having the discussion in a
Sure.
mixed company.
Sure.
Right.
Partially because you don't know whose history,
Sure,
who has
yeah.
what history that you're
Right.
talking about. And so I think in mixed company, we are always to profess Christ Jesus. We are to be the light in
Sure.
the darkness.
Yeah.
And that when we respond to things with great compassion, I think that we get a little bit of grace in the fact that we may not agree. And I think if you're talking to women and we're talking about pro-choice and we're talking about it's my body and we're in that context, recognizing that there are broader issues, involved. I think there's a different conversation when I'm talking to unbelievers than when I'm talking to believers.
Oh, totally.
It's not that there's a different truth, there's just a different
way of
that I
approaching and-
approach them.
Yeah.
And I think it's very reasonable to say that, as a father, as my beautiful children, like, I couldn't imagine not having them. And I advocate for children, at every part of their life. I understand it's difficult, and women, are left with the brunt of a lot of that difficulty. And I
Totally.
think
Right.
that goes into what you're saying, in that, our abortion epidemic is a failure of the structure in our society. We have failed to value life, marriage,
Right.
home,
Yeah.
children.
Both
Both
male,
having
female, yes.
both male and female. We've dissociated,
Right.
the fact of children from responsibility
Right.
and, caring for them being a point of integrity.
Right.
We have a lot of failings in our culture, and our abortion rates are reflective
Right.
of that. And so I think that you're not going to always get off where it's perfectly well received. You're
Well,
going to bump
sure.
into some
Yeah,
people
I
who are
mean-
like, "How can you say it's my body?" Absolutely,
Yeah.
but the baby is a different person in your body at all points.
Yeah.
And you're carrying them, and you can't do bad things to other people you're carrying at any other scenario
Right.
without it being a problem.
Sure.
But I don't think that's a scenario that that it's always going to be comfortable, and it's not meant to be uncomfortable, because there are great difficulties in it, and
Yeah.
great sadness, and I don't think it's ever going to be easy. There's not a right way to have that conversation.
always
I think
messy.
it's always messy. You just respond in truth and in compassion
Right.
for the other difficulties, and you may get a couple raised brows at you, and
Sure.
being tough enough to take that. I do think there's a great role for men in counseling boys and young men on what it means to be that. And I think in our youth ministries, as we're getting into the teenagers, I don't know that we really do delve into these issues well, so that our 17-year-old, when his girlfriend says, "I'm late," he doesn't go, "Well, that sounds like your problem," and leave her abandoned in that he recognizes that there is an appropriate that this means something, and there's an appropriate response. This has changed my course, just like it changed hers, in a more absolute way. And I think that if because babies don't come by themselves, there's
Right.
two people involved, and both of them are equally responsible. For parents, the same way of us being able to hopefully educate our children to be chaste, but if in the case that they're not,
People are people, and sin is sin, and
right, and that
Yeah.
we are parents being the resource for that. That if they are in trouble, just like in any other situation, that we want to be a safe landing place, and hopefully that we are counseling them appropriately.
Right.
There's a large proportion of teenagers, who they have terminations because they feel they're too young to care for a baby. But they have parents oftentimes. Sometimes they don't tell their parents
Right.
that this is going on.
which makes me so sad that they don't have to.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
that's just such a sad, like,
Well, it's devastating.
It is.
Yeah. But as parents, it didn't prohibit us from educating our children.
Right, sure.
We
I
say,
mean, we
if
still
you're
have that
drinking, if
responsibility.
there's drugs, if someone's drunk driving,
You call
me,
me,
I'll
yeah.
come and get you. We don't say, if you miss your period and you're in trouble, you better tell me so that I can help you and I can
Yeah.
walk through this with you, and you don't have to be alone in a difficult situation.
Yeah.
We not talking about premarital sex has no beneficial impact
No.
on it, and so it is still happening whether the church talks about it or they don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And especially with our young people, I feel like for the men that it is part of the conversation that needs to happen. And we used to have it where dad sat on the front porch with a shotgun, and if you something was going on,
I don't have a gun
I
yet,
know.
but I'm going to soon.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
knew that there was an expectation
Yeah.
of this, that you would behave a certain way. And I'm not saying, every teenagers need to get married. That's not what I'm saying. But
Sure.
there's an expectation that if you create a life, it should be in our culture, in our church, where we have those beliefs, that you care for it,
Right.
and that you're responsible, and that you do the things that are necessary, so that our young men and our or individuals who are in that situation know this is the expected
appropriate,
course
yeah.
for me, so that I can respond. Because a lot of times when women are coming in for terminations, they are not coming in with their partner.
Oh, yeah.
They are making a decision by themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And when there are scenarios where there is a partner who is strongly advocating that they desire this child, there are lower rates of termination because they've got at least the perception of support and help and being able to do this. So I think the role of men in it is huge, and being able to assert that they are willing and able and eager to do the things that are needed to care for this new life. So
Yeah, I mean, and I know that there are situations where, and what you're saying is their role is so vital, because if they're advocating for the termination, it is very strong,
Right.
That will
Exactly.
continue and that will
Exactly.
happen. So I think men might underestimate their role in that, right? Because
I think our culture
it's-
tries to diminish it to a degree.
Well,
I mean,
most
that's
definitely.
well, that sounds like
Yeah.
right up the enemy's alley.
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
That if we
Yeah.
could pull men out of the home and
Right.
then
the whole unit
crumbles.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Totally.
And so that's just another avenue where we try to separate the role of that father in the life of that child. So I think that, like I said, it's a big cultural shift, but we all have a role to play in it, even
Right.
in how we
Yeah.
educate our own children, how we come alongside and support other people. I think the church definitely has a role to shift in that we should be really strong advocates for abstinence and for children to be
Right.
chaste and virginity. Let's bring virginity back.
Yes.
So these are we should be really great advocates for that, but we should also be soft landings when this doesn't happen, so that individuals don't pull away. When they're in
Yeah.
these situations, that they run to instead, because that's where we'd be able to make changes in situations so it doesn't happen again and again.
Right.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It seems like it boils down to, for men and women, it boils down to, if we mentor the next generation and then they the next generation, that could, at least within the church context, that could do a lot. And again, soft landing. I like how you said that, because people are people, and even people who are following Jesus hardly make a choice, and then, well, here we go. Here's the consequence. But
Yeah, I like the, again, it's that accountability,
Right.
it's the grace, and I think the church has a place in educating the teens,
Right.
not being afraid to talk about it,
Right.
and supporting the teenage boys, those men coming up, that contradictory to what they hear in the culture, their role is vital, right? Their role is
Yeah.
just as important, and because you're right, they do feel diminished, I think, in the culture outside. So.
And if we don't, the culture constantly berates all of us with, this detached sexuality, this detached from children and family, or have you. And if we don't give any voices in that contradict that, all that anyone ever hears is what the enemy promotes. And so we've got to be comfortable enough to be able to discuss the issues and in a way that equips individuals on how to deal with it if they're in that situation. It's not a lot of times for individuals, it's like a brand new situation. They may or may not know anyone who's ever been in that situation. They do, they just don't know that they've been in that
True.
scenario again. They don't think there's anyone that they can talk to about it. They feel like they're the only person who has this, and that's not true. And these aren't uncommon things. This is something that will happen to someone in our church this year, maybe more.
Sure.
And so we have to, I think equip, definitely the younger generation and to be, prepared because these things are going to come up. I don't know if, what do you do if one of your classmates gets pregnant is on the preteen, high school student, I would imagine.
Yeah.
How do we respond to them as believers?
Right.
And I think a lot of times we're afraid to talk about it because we think if we talk about it, it's that we are advocating that it's okay.
Right.
And that's not what we're doing. We're just recognizing that it exists.
Right.
And that our young people are going to be, faced with it. And they should be equipped to know, well, what does my faith say about this? And how should I treat someone? And how can I be a blessing to them? And what's really important, the reality of it, yes, they had sex out of wedlock, but probably so did 5 of my other friends. They're just not pregnant.
Right.
And how do I, embrace this person in a way? Why can't I invite her to youth group? Because, these are important questions that we
they're
have
practical.
to, right, exactly,
Yeah.
that, we have to deal with. So.
And you can love the person,
Right.
and you can hate the sin.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, just because you're embracing that person in a Christ-like manner does not mean that you're embracing what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that you can stand against the things that are sinful, even if you don't stand against the person
Yeah.
who's engaged with it.
Which has become tricky culturally because
Right.
the idea
Yeah.
culturally is that if you don't accept me in everything that I
Right.
do,
Right.
you hate me.
Right.
Which
It's the whole
is
binary thing,
Right,
right? It's like
right.
black or white.
Exactly.
It's just easier to do it that way when human beings are just a mess.
Right.
Like, I'll do 5 things in the next 30 minutes that someone I know doesn't like.
Right.
It's just,
Exactly.
we are a mess, and therefore we need to lean on grace and the fact that God had grace on us, and we give back that same grace to others. And yeah, I mean, we're all on this journey, and God unfortunately gave us free will to make really stupid decisions.
Right.
And sometimes we're going to make the wrong ones, and we just need to have grace for each other, especially within the church. Because one thing I see in our culture today, I don't know if you're familiar with the term cancel culture, but it's the idea that someone does, tweeted something 10 years ago, and then they're fired from their job today,
Right.
and it's like, and I get it, you shouldn't have said that 10 years
Right.
ago, but here,
Well, hopefully you grew up.
but that's the thing. It's like over
Yeah.
10 years, it's like,
Right.
who was I 10
I'm not
years
the
ago?
same person.
Oh my goodness. And so there's this complete lack of forgiveness and compassion in our culture. It is just like, you did that 10 years ago, you're done.
Right.
And if the church needs be a beacon anywhere, it's like we need to be a beacon of forgiveness and redemption. I mean, that is the story of all of us.
Right.
That we were broken and sinful and we needed redemption. Like,
Yeah.
all of us are in that boat.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
the only
There's
one not in that
one.
boat, Jesus.
Jesus,
Like,
exactly.
no one else. If you think you're in the boat, you're in the boat.
Exactly.
So,
When I think,
Yeah.
just real fast, I just think being vulnerable and being open about that,
Totally.
not in a bragging way, but in a relationship.
let me tell you about all the stupid
yeah,
things.
let me. But
Exactly.
when
Yeah.
we are more open with our peers and those that we
Yeah.
encounter, then that just opens the door. It
Right.
just opens the door to
Yeah.
share. So
Exactly. I know for in my practice, I wind up having a lot of difficult conversations with patients and patients that are coming up against things like they have children with multiple anomalies or they they have a genetic disorder that they're anticipating or other concerns. And I think a lot of times even in those scenarios, we see individuals who have children who are may have some vulnerabilities or some differences. And even in that case, we embrace children, but we don't always embrace, those families that have, pursued and they've got this sequelae of issues to contend with. And that's another place where it's not in line with the forgiveness, but I just wanted to make sure that I commented because, they, have pursued a more challenging role.
Right.
And we should be rejoicing in the fact that there is, great difference and there's great value in life of all sorts, and to be able to come alongside of them. So, I mean, I feel like for the church, our belief system should be reflected in our practice, not just in our verbiage and what we say, but that because we honor life, we, embrace it and we support, individuals who are pursuing their pregnancies and despite difficulties, and we are a safe covering for those who maybe did not, but we can help them with healing and recovery, because just like Jesus often gives us we fail, he gives us another chance. Come on, Alli. Okay. Exactly. Here we go again. And so that when individuals maybe are challenged with that themselves, or they encounter someone else, that they are now free to be able to help them and talk, honestly and
speaking
way.
to the people who have children who have mental disabilities and all that, we have Foothills Shepherds at the church, which is awesome, but in need of volunteers.
Okay. See?
When it comes to you, I'm sure you would like to have a resource of people to call.
Sure.
Volunteers are difficult to get because, for anything, let alone something difficult like that. But that is a reality. We need to not be able to just say hey, we have this program. We need to have that program, and it needs to be staffed by volunteers who just have a heart for people.
Heart for that,
Volunteers who adopt.
That's right.
we need to, as a church, be willing to bring some of these things on, and they're going to cause our life difficulty, but I feel like the best things in life were some of the hardest things to attain.
Right.
And it's marriage is difficult, but man, the benefits of it, and being a parent, super hard, but goodness, I would not give it up for anything. It's good. Easy doesn't mean good.
Right.
Right. Yeah. It's not necessarily good to just always be comfortable.
Exactly.
I was wondering, we can kind of wrap with this. This has been awesome, and we might even do a follow-up at some point. But do you have any kind of stories of someone who's, say, come to PCS and has just kind of come back post and just kind of shared kind of the ministry of what PCS has done for them, or without divulging or whatever?
Yes, I would say, because we have recently in the last over a year started new pregnancy and parenting education. So, so that can start during their pregnancy. We've even started women post giving birth, but just actual education and valuable information, which I love to see that they're actually learning from these. It's a DVD based program, and then they can purchase resources at our center with the dollars that they earn. But with that, it's exciting to see a shift in the fact that we're not just seeing a woman once or twice, and then 6 or 8 months later, she might come back in with her baby. What we're now seeing her through her pregnancy, and then we're continuing to see her after, and just continuing to love on her. And so that's exciting because then we get to grow with her. We get to, and they actually like to come in. They love
it's
to.
like visiting friends or family.
Exactly. They feel comfortable. They get to see people that they have become friendships with. They get a little relief from their baby, and we get to hold them. Then they can oh, well, this is happening or this is happening, and just kind of be heard. So it's that continued relationship, which has been really fun to see.
That's awesome.
And so, I do have a client who, not naming any names, but has continued from when she was halfway through her pregnancy and is now still coming. I think the baby is probably at least 4 months old. But seeing her grow from, the first call thinking when she called saying, I'm 18 weeks pregnant and I don't know what to do. And me counseling her and saying, okay, you know what? This is a really good thing. And letting her be heard and realizing that even amidst difficulties, like I remember sharing with her, God's using this as like, maybe this will bring joy, right? In the midst of maybe health concerns or this or that, or this going on, that this can be a light, right? This can be a good thing. And telling her, I want you to use PCS as a place of hope to come and learn practical knowledge, but also have friends. And she's done that. And so then to hear her words later say, I was considering an abortion until those first few times of like, okay, I'm not in this alone. It doesn't have to be so scary. So that's that's what I love to see is that shift from, I remember the board when they interviewed me saying, how would you have this conversation? What would you say to a woman that you might only see once? And I'm like, you can't do that in one conversation. You can't preach the gospel and save the baby in one conversation. But to have a relationship and to have an avenue or a reason for them to keep coming, that's where you're going to see growth. So.
I think knowing that you will encounter some people that are kind of on the edge of what they're deciding. They haven't decided that they are going to pursue the pregnancy. They may be getting pressures to terminate from the outside. Sometimes the father of the baby. Sometimes other family members, their own parents, sometimes are pressuring them. And I think being able to assert that babies and pregnancies in and of themselves are a good thing. They and I know that may seem like a fundamental understanding, but our society does not promote them as a good thing. Scenarios may be less advantageous. The situation may not be ideal, but the baby in and of itself is a good thing. And that often we can deal with and work with the other aspects that surround it. I think that, we have to continue to be that voice that advocates that they are a good thing. And to be there for the women and families that struggle through those decisions. I love establishing a relationship is super important because we don't know. Sometimes I have this conversation and I didn't win for this baby. But the next baby, we've already planted seeds that, maybe they didn't flourish this time, but the next time they may come back and say, well, I'm going to go here because this was a really good supportive place and I recognize I do have some options. So I'm going to pursue those so that we don't lose hope that, if we don't see immediate results with our advocacy, that by educating, our young people as they're growing up appropriately, by us changing our stance and our verbiage universally about babies, that they are good, even if, it's her 8th and she's not married, it's the baby is still a good thing. And, I do think there's hope. And that we should continue to promote hope and to advocate even when it's not popular. When you're advocating for the babies in a community where it's not popular to stand up for life, but all with compassion.
I remember one time a client came in and she had a couple other children, but I remember her sharing that she was pregnant. We took she did a test in our center, but she said, "Oh, my mom's just going to be so disappointed." I know. And realizing the reality for her in that every other pregnancy that she had, she never had the reality of, "Mom, I'm pregnant." That joy,
that experience
that we take for granted in our church of like, oh, yay, and having people around us be happy. And I remember just telling her, I looked at her and I hugged her with permission, and I said, I said, yay, you're having a baby. You know, like, I mean, just that joy, that thing we just take for granted, that it's a
Totally,
good
yeah.
thing that she had never experienced that before. So yeah, it's just getting into the mess a little bit.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, that's what the Christian life is. It's getting into the mess and working through it. I like that this conversation, like what I pulled from it is just conversations, like having like kind of counseling, having compassion, having grace, and just openness is probably your strongest tools in this.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we hear all the time, all the debates, and like, oh, they really got him that time. But it's like, that's not going to change minds. It's not going to change hearts.
Yeah.
It's within relationship. It's counseling. It's diverting, maybe pushing them towards you if I can't, quite get there because I don't have the same experience or whatever. But that life is valuable. These babies are valuable. God has a heart for these babies.
Right.
And if you want to be a part of that solution, you adopt, you talk to people, you mentor, you counsel, you do all this kind of stuff. And just pray that God's changing hearts and just be that resource. I think that's... It's one of those. It's such a big thing, and that just makes it sound doable.
Right. Well, I think if we're acting in love, it's definitely important for us to have love and zeal for the babies, but we want to have love and zeal for the family, the moms and the dads who are involved in these situations.
And that's like the mentorship counseling stuff.
Exactly.
I mean, Paul says, without love, your words are like a resounding gong. Like it's like it just means nothing.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly.
Well, do you have any closing thoughts? I mean, we've said a lot, but I want to give you an opportunity if you got something.
I mean, there's a quote that sticks out with me. When we talk about, just to kind of bring it back to where we started with this political side of this issue. The producer of the movie Unplanned that came out earlier this year was interviewed, and
Abigail something. Abby, wasn't that her name? Abby Johnson.
Oh, Abby Johnson. Yeah, the movie about her.
Yeah.
Yes. And the producer was asked, are you hopeful? Are you wanting this movie to make abortion, illegal, right, or to put an end to this? And he looked at the reporter and he said, actually, I want abortion to become unthinkable.
Right.
Right? Where it's not necessarily a matter of what's happening in the political realm, but it's all about education and changing people's hearts.
Right.
So that,
God's in the business of heart change.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
So.
And I think that's a wonderful kind of theme for us all to follow, and that we want to be a part of changing people's hearts towards this. And if we change their heart, we will change their actions. And if we don't change their hearts, we won't make any kind of dent in this. And that, and I think for believers, a lot of times we feel like, this is so big, it's so overwhelming, we've gotten so far. But, with God, all things are possible. And that with each scenario, I
forget that a lot of times.
we have to remember that this is the heart. This is definitely something that is the heart of God. Abortion is not of him in any way. And that that should encourage us to remain steadfast in figuring out different ways that we can reach out, we can be part of the solution. We can make sure that even in unpleasant conversation, we represent Jesus. But we also represent a soft landing in that we want to be able to say, we believe in life, and if if someone's in a situation, come talk to me.
Right.
I'm here. Like, I understand things happen, and so. I think that not only does this conversation, unfold a lot of things that are going on, but it unfolds a lot of opportunities. So I'm hoping anyone who listens, grabs onto some way that they can be part of the solution. And even if that's just, talking to their neighbor who's a single mom and supporting them.
Right.
Right.
And this has been,
Yeah, lots of different things. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap this awesome conversation. Wow. Thank you so much. If you have questions, it may be something that was said here sparked and you want to talk to someone, you can always call PCS. Yeah. You can email Foothills Church and we can get you connected with anything that you need to support you in this. But thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate you sharing some wisdom. And God willing, this will be used for heart change. And we'll see you next time. Cool.